I'm Yvette Benavides, and this is The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public on Texas Public Radio. We continue our short series this week on the stories of Juan Rulfo. By the time he was 10 years old, Juan Rulfo had lost both of his parents. He had little exposure to books while living with his grandmother, but after her death, surprisingly, it was the orphanage that afforded him access to books and even to access to enrolling in university. Financial pressures, but also boredom, led to his terminating his formal education after 2 years. He married, and he and his wife had 4 children. Rulfo always maintained a day job and referred to writing as a pastime. This even after he was awarded the National Literary Prize, Mexico's highest literary honor in the year 1970. Tales of the Mexican Revolution had already captured the imaginations of readers in and around Mexico. Rulfo offered something new by writing stories set in the stark rural landscapes of Mexico. The harsh, arid environment and the violent lives of poor inhabitants populate the stories in El Llano en Llamas, his celebrated short story collection published in 1953. Es que somos muy pobres, translated to It's because we're so poor, is one of the stories from this collection. Here we find a family of 4 living on a farm. They are very poor, so poor that their only resource is the crop of barley that is now ruined by the curtains of rain and the rising river that floods the land. A calf was to be the dowry offered to marry off Tacha, the young daughter who has just turned 12. Her parents fear that if they don't marry her off, she will become a woman of ill repute, as did her 2 older sisters, now long gone and banished from the house. The narrator here is Tacha's brother, who reveals the story that asks many questions for which the final answer seems to be, it's because we are so poor. He reveals the devastating news that the cow is gone, floated away in the filthy floodwaters. And what can we make of a story that depicts the sorrows of this family, one that has pinned all their hopes for the future on marrying off Tacha and her dowry of that cow? What can readers learn about from a story like this one set in the desolate, inhospitable landscape where miraculous rain becomes a punishing downpour and a flood that devastates the family's livelihood? Rulfo's characters in the stories throughout this collection endure. They don't turn corners to enlightenment. They don't rise up against the corruption and violence that is a fact of life in their small villages and towns. They don't break barriers or bound over obstacles to tidy, hopeful endings. But they endure. In his essay, Winter in September, Peter Orner ruminates on The First Day of Winter by Brice DJ Pancake. Another story, another family, this one in West Virginia, another farm, and another ruined crop from fields soon left to fallow. He writes that what's beautiful and wrenching is that there is no resolution, and you don't come to a story like this for answers. Think of it as you might an old trusted friend, the sort of friend who offers no glib, false sense of hope, just a quiet fortitude. The same can be said of Juan Rulfo's story. We see the family's quiet fortitude in the face of the worst thing that's happened to them, the terrible event that has sealed the fate of young Tacha, and the beautiful and wrenching aspects of that bring us back to this story again and again. On this episode of The Lonely Voice, Peter Orner and I discuss Juan Rulfo's It's Because We're So Poor. So doesn't the first line of this story sound like the first line of a lot of our personal emails to people in 2020?
Yeah. Everything's going from bad to worse here.
No context needed. Nothing else needs to be said. Everything's going from bad to worse.
And like, who's this narrator talking to? Everything's going. It's. There's a certain, like you said, almost like an email, like the intimacy of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like talking directly to you there. Everything's going from bad to worse here. you know. And it's just like we're right. We don't know who this is. We don't know anything, but we're in it.
So the litany. Last week, my Aunt Jacinta died. And on Saturday, after we had buried her and the sadness had begun to fade away, it started raining like crazy.
Yeah.
This upset my father since the entire barley harvest was drying in the rickyard. The downpour started suddenly in great waves of water, giving us no time to stow even a handful. And it just goes on, this short litany of problems.
This upset my father since the entire barley harvest was drying in the rickyard. It's just such a, I mean, you know, and it's hard to talk about translation because that's a whole nother. I'd have to be up for being able to do that, and I can't. But I just love the clarity of this opening, you know, and the voice is totally established. Who's talking? And, you know, apparently it's a younger kid. Right. I think the problem with the other translation, I would say, is the translator thought the kid was younger, or went out of his way to make it sound like a young kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the newer translation, the Stavans, doesn't do that. He is a kid, but it doesn't feel like gone out of its way to make him a kid.
And then the kicker. And just yesterday, my sister Dacha's 12th birthday, we found out that the cow my father had given her for her Saint's Day had been swept down the river. From bad to worse.
Right. And then this beautiful description of, that slow motion catastrophe that a flood is. The river started to rise 3 nights ago around dawn. Though I was sound asleep, the thunderous noise woke me up. I jumped up to my feet with the cover still in my hand, as though I thought the roof of my house was caving in. Then I fell asleep again because I realized it was only the sound of the river, and because the sound lulled me to sleep. That's such a, it's just a, again, not to be hyperbolic, but if you're going to describe a flood, that's the way to go. Like it doesn't feel like a threat. How can this hurt us?
Yeah.
It's just the river.
I realized it was only the sound of the river, and because the sound lulled me, it's like it's just a fact of their life.
Yeah. And once in a while it's deadly, but for the most part it isn't, right? And so why would okay, so it's raining a lot, right? But that's how it goes, right? I mean, suddenly you reach a point where it goes from it's raining a lot to it being an incredible disaster.
I haven't really studied the scholarship around these stories very much.
Good.
I just haven't had to, and I haven't had the desire to. I know the basic things about the revolution and the rest, but the idea about the government forgetting the poor, the government denying the poor of every basic thing, it's in all the stories by Rulfo, in one way or another. And you don't even have to really know that little thread of context and know the decade he was reflecting on in the 1920s. It's just the idea of the river for me here is, it's this natural thing. And you think about like the natural disasters that we hear about on the news or experience more closely. It's almost like this idea of, this is why sometimes I feel like I don't need to know the context. I just need the story. Because the story is so often enough that if there's this subtext or if there's this other idea here about the failures of the government, there's still this raging river in the immediate.
And this is a conversation I have with myself a lot, and also sometimes with colleagues, how to talk about stories without overburdening them with context. I mean, they wouldn't be as powerful if they needed the context, if they needed an external context. It's not to say it's not helpful and interesting, and going back to read about the revolution and sort of the Mexico that Rulfo was born into and grew up in, this incredible place of upheaval that it went from one system to an entirely different one was what he grew up into. So it makes sense, but I think he somehow was able almost to write, not without the context, but try his best, again, as an artist in Mexico City, mostly, right, and other places that he bounced around. But he wasn't, my sense is, from my limited understanding, is that he wasn't necessarily writing these stories when he was among the people that he grew up among them, but then he left, is how I understand it. I think he was making thunderous political points only by telling the stories of these people as elementally as he could.
I think it was Sontag in the introduction who said that he wrote about it from the tangents. He wrote about it from the corners of it. He lived through it. I mean, you can't divorce him from that context, right? But you don't need to know it to get something out of the story. No, and it's. I think it is the story. There's something uncomfortable about even the title of this story to talk about, from my house in 2020. Mm-hmm.
I'm worried that my kids are home because of COVID stuff, and how the hell am I going to get any work done today? And then I'm reading the stories because we're so poor. It's hard to read that title as apolitical. It's not. But then when you enter the first line, even the sort of ginned upness, arguably, of the title falls away, and you're in this boy's voice talking about what his sister has lost in the flood, her cow.
Yeah, because anytime you come to the point of incredulity, like, how can that matter? Like, how would you get from point A to point Z? How can you imagine that this will be the fate of your sister? And the answer es que somos muy pobres. The answer is, it's because we're so poor. The answer to anytime you hit a wall with this story and you're just not understanding what's the problem? Why is this a problem? Why does this seal the family's fate? Oh, it's because we're so poor. I mean, it's such an unusual title, but it's also an answer.
I try and think of other writers that have titled stories in a similar way, and I cannot think of one. Usually there's like sort of a little bit of an ironic ring when you have a story that sort of seems explainy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, where is this voice coming from? That's the closest one I can think of, a Welty story about the shooting of Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi, her hometown, and she wrote that story in a fiery rage the night that it happened, and she called the title, where's this voice coming from? And I think that it's a question. This is not a question. This is an answer. Mm-hmm. And there's something guidey about both titles, but this one is even more so. Like you say, it is the answer. And yet, what are we supposed to do with that as a reader? It sort of sets you on your heels before you even start the story. And I think that's just incredibly unusual, but shows what kind of artists we're dealing with.
I understand the need some people have to study the life of the writer and try to find the clues that way. I mean, Rulfo lost his father. I think Rulfo was 6, and I think the father died violently, and then his mother died of a heart attack. He was maybe 10 years old.
Right.
And then he ended up in an orphanage, and the violence of that time, too. I mean, the poverty and the violence, yes, this is something that was a big part of Rulfo's life. And then, as he's further away from the situation and in a different city, and doing different things, very different things. He's hearkening back to this rural setting and, the natural landscape and the natural devastation, and really like just the desolation of these people who really don't have a porvenir, or don't feel like they have much of a future because they're so poor.
And that's so basic.
I know.
I wonder, he was a strange figure, and I can understand why people want to know more about him. I certainly do, and I, checked out the one book the Dartmouth College Library had about him, and there's pages ripped out of the book, because I think people, are just so hungry for, like, some Rulfo, like, context, like you said, and literally the story we talked about last time, you don't hear the dogs barking, kind of lame critical analysis that is in this book is ripped out. It's gone.
Wow.
So I'm just saying that there is this sort of hunger when you have a writer who's a little bit mysterious because of the little that he wrote. We just kind of want to know what he was up to. But I think what he was up to is like you started this conversation, it's in the story itself. And in this story, it's actually, a lot of it's in the title. And then you got to read the story, to know that.
It's because we're so poor. You say to somebody, hey, read the story. What's it called? It's because we're so poor. Okay, open it up. Everything's going from bad to worse here.
Right.
And yeah, that's right. It is so basic. And that's important.
And the stories are unremittingly dark in some ways. Not in every way. I mean, I think even in this story, you have a love between a brother and a sister. That love, as in some of his other stories, can get twisted, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe there's a beauty in at least how devastated this boy is for what his sister has lost. I did want to say I did look up some other stuff about Rulfo, and I got a little deeper this time. And there's one thing I thought I would read. This is from some interview. He says, Rulfo has said that during childhood, this is from the Hispanic Journal from 1991, Rulfo has said that during his childhood he spent a great deal of time reading because people did not leave their homes for fear of getting shot. He states, it was rare if we didn't see one of our own people hung by the feet on some post on whatever road. They stayed there until they became old, and then curled up like untanned leather. The vultures would eat their insides, leaving only a shell. And since they hung them very high, they would sway in the breeze many days, sometimes months, sometimes only the tatters of their pants billowing out of the wind as if someone had put them out to dry there. So that's Rulfo's childhood memory. Now, again, he's a storyteller. Do we entirely believe him? Of course I believe him, and we certainly knew this stuff went on in Mexico as it went on other places, as it goes on other places. But that's where he's coming from as a child. So how can we say to him, well, Rulfo, your stories are so dark, and now you're writing about kids, and those stories are dark too? My God, this is really dark.
The idea of the morning sky in that very next paragraph, the general symbol of promise, a new day. The morning sky was full of huge clouds, and everything looked as if it had been raining nonstop. So we know it's just a continuation. It's not a bright spot. The noise from the river was louder than ever and had drawn closer. So this has gone on overnight, and we're still in it. Right.
And people who've lived through cataclysmic floods know this. You just kind of hope that it's not going to hit that certain level. And then there's this weird line. We talked about this before. You could smell it the way you can smell a fire, the rotten smell of roiling water. and think about how like a flood would smell, because it's unusual. Like the water is all churned up, and there's things in it that shouldn't be, and so it does smell different. Like if Rulfo is really focusing on the physicality of this really intense, slow-moving threat.
Yeah, because a flood is not just water, ever. It's always going to be filthy and cluttered with things that shouldn't be there.
Right.
By the time I went outside, the river had already spilled over its banks and was slowly approaching the main street. It was quickly making its way into the house of the woman people call La Tambora. I really wanted to know more about her just because that's what they called her. So, but it's enough. It's enough. It's just, another person in this scene, part of the life and culture of this place. And it doesn't matter. I mean, tambora has the sense of a drum, like a big bass drum. And it can also mean tub, which I found interesting. But we're not going to talk about.
Well, but I think it's worth asking why La Tambora appears and disappears in 3 sentences in a story that's only 4 pages long. Why do we detour into looking at the house of the woman people call La Tambora, when her house is flooding, when everyone else's houses are flooding too? Like what? Like there isn't any reasonable kind of story reason to have her there. And all I'd say is, I've been thinking about this. I think a lot of Rulfo's stories, and this one is a really good example, are stories told by people who don't tell stories, or don't tell stories in the way that, there's a point A to point B to point C. That this boy is recounting the flood, and he's just thinking what images come into his mind about it. Mm-hmm. As he gradually moves into what the story's, what his main preoccupation about the flood is, but he's not just setting the scene here. He's remembering it remembering it in real time, and then La Tambora's house, and then there's that tree, which is in the next line, the tamarind trees that had been in Aunt Yasita's rickyard, and we already know what happened to her. The aunt has died, and her tamarind tree is gone now too. It was the only one in town, and that's why people think this is the highest the river has crested in years. So La Tambora's house, the aunt's house, the tree, like it's all like this very intimate, and we're in his very small world, this kid,
Yeah. I like that idea of the small world, and like it's his retelling. He's not worried about, the narrative arc or the structure or whatever.
Right.
He's, just retelling the story. Y luego, La Tambora en la casa de la Tambora. You can just imagine it. And it's there's something so earnest about it too. And honest somehow. It's just, I like this idea that you mentioned, his own small world. This is what he's retelling. This is what he has. There's more to it than just the flood and the family. And I just like the inclusion of La Tambora.
and then, because I want to get back to, there's another moment in the story where I think is a really good example of what you just described, where he asks an eyewitness to the cow's demise to tell him what happened, and then he recounts that, but it's not like he sets the scene or anything, But before we get there, I think we have to talk about what happens to the cow and what they're doing, and the kids, the brother and the sister at this point. He talks about La Tambora he talks about the tree, and then they go to the ravine to look. My sister and I went back in the afternoon to see the cascade of water steadily growing thicker and darker and already beyond the level where the bridge is supposed to be. We stayed there for hours and hours without getting bored with the whole thing. Isn't that fascinating? We stayed there for hours and hours without getting bored with the whole thing. It sounds so colloquial, so ordinary, so, kind of how it easily would have been said today. Later on, we climbed up the ravine because we wanted to hear what people were saying, since down there near the river it's so loud you can only see mouths opening and closing as if they want to say something, but you can't hear a word. So we climbed up the ravine where people were looking at the river and talking about the damage it had done. That's where we found out that the river had carried away La Serpentina, my sister Tatcha's cow, because my father gave my sister the cow as a birthday present, and it had one white ear and one red one and very beautiful eyes.
What do you make of that section about people who look like their mouths are opening and closing, but you can't hear a word?
It's just so great. It's so great. I mean, they're plain, really. And they're, but it takes so much eye to see that. To see I see it. I see the scene. I see all these people. He just gives us those people and their mouths opening.
Yeah, the whole rest of the world is deaf to them. I mean, they don't have a voice, number one. But I also like that he repeats in a very kind of non-writerly, non-revision way that
Right.
he repeats that the father gave the sister the cow for the birthday. Like we just saw that on the facing page. And
Right.
he says it again because that's what people do.
That's what people do.
Yeah.
And I mean, the repetition, there's actually literally repeated sentences in this story. The same sentence a few sentences later in the same paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Because exactly that's how people who tell. I mean, people tell stories this way, not because there's any agenda or anything.
Mm-hmm. And this poor cow. So he decides.
La Serpentina, does that have it? What is La Serpentina?
Serpentina, it's like serpentine, like circuitous, like a serpent, like coiling and zigzaggy serpentine.
Isn't that a funny name for a cow?
Very funny.
It's just not what I think of when I think of a cow.
But then I imagine that a cow named La Serpentina is going to be a wayward cow that goes where she shouldn't go, So,
yeah.
But that's a little too tidy. But the idea from the speaker is that she decided to cross that river when she knew quite well it wasn't the same river.
Right, because La Serpentina wasn't that dumb to let herself be killed like she must have been sleepwalking. To let herself be killed like that, she must have been sleepwalking, he says.
The thing about this section where he's deliberating about she must have been asleep, I've caught her that way before, and I've had to wake her up. It's such a search for meaning, for an answer in that one little section, and it's really just to himself.
And it's so the intimacy that he has. Mm-hmm. Remember, it's his sister's cow, but he seems to take care of it. Most of the time it was up to me to wake her when I opened the corral door to let her out. If not, she might have spent the entire day there with her eyes closed, very still and sighing, the way cows sigh when they're asleep. I mean, this cow is also a character.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think, now that we're talking about it, I mean, I'm sure there are great stories about cows, with personalities, but La Serpentina's got to be up there. If he didn't come let her out, she might have spent the entire day in there with her eyes closed, very still and sighing.
And just the idea of them not knowing if, let's see, where is it? We don't know if the calf is alive or if he followed his mother down the river. But this, I just skipped over the part where he asks the man.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind reading that.
Yo le pregunté a un señor que vio cuando la arrastraba el río si no había visto también al becerrito que andaba con ella, pero el hombre dijo que no sabía si lo había visto. Solo dijo que la vaca manchada pasó patas arriba, muy cerquita de donde él estaba, y que allí dio una voltereta y luego no volvió a ver ni los cuernos, ni las patas, ni ninguna señal de vaca. Por el río rodaban muchos troncos de árboles con todo y raíces, y él estaba muy ocupado en sacar leña, de modo que no podía fijarse si eran animales o troncos los que arrastraba.
I asked a man who saw the cow being dragged downstream if he hadn't seen the calf that was with her. But the man said he didn't know if he had seen that. All he said was that the spotted cow went by with her legs in the air very close to where he was. And then she flipped over, and he couldn't see the horns of the legs or any sign of the cow at all. There were plenty of tree trunks floating on the river with their roots and all, and he was very busy trying to gather firewood, so he wasn't able to see if it was animals or tree trunks being carried away. So you have a guy who's he goes to to an eyewitness to the cow's drowning and tells us this incredible image. The guy tells him, and he just reports it to us. The guy tells him he saw the cow with the legs up, and look, I didn't have a chance to really think about see the calf because I was too busy. There was firewood coming down the river, and I needed to grab that, right? And so, and there you have it. How do you see the translation?
Oh, it's quite literal. It's word for word.
And it captures the kind of almost flatness of it. Like this could be really dramatic.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's just, it's dramatic enough by being flat.
Exactly.
Because you see the cow with the legs up in the air. I mean, talk about an image, right? But you mean the calf? Oh, I didn't see any calf. I was too busy getting the firewood. Like Rulfo knows that people aren't sightseeing out there, right? There's no time for that. And so if something valuable is floating down the river, Rulfo knows that they're going to be focused on that.
Yeah.
His story be damned, right?
At the very next, the transition is the problem at home.
Right. And here we go. And then the story goes in places where, even though I was still surprised and unsettled and even a little shocked, again, where the story goes.
Yeah. Because we know the value of, of livestock, of a cow for milk, say, right?
Right.
But this is a much bigger problem because we are poor.
Right.
So the problem at home is what is going to happen now that my sister Tacha is left with nothing. And if somebody says, "What do you mean nothing? What do you mean?" It's because we're poor. It's sort of like this logic that is maybe hard for us to understand, but this is his, as you said, this is his small world. This is what he understands.
Right, but it takes this kind of intense turn, still in the voice of this boy, but I feel like the story, goes from sort of strangling me to like, I don't know, stabbing me in the gut or whatever, like a slow strangle to like, do you want to read the rest of that paragraph?
Yes, Tacha is left with nothing. It took a lot for my father to get La Serpentina in the first place from the time she was a calf, so my sister could have a bit of capital and wouldn't run away to become a whore the way my two older sisters had. What?
It's like at the back end of the sentence. It ends the paragraph. It's like, oh, and the only thing, this is maybe cutting too much to the chase, but the only thing preventing this story is largely about the only thing that was preventing this little kid. I mean, it's a heartbreaking, harsh story. Suddenly, that this boy believes that the only thing that preventing his sister from running off and becoming a whore like his two other sisters is this dead cow. Mm-hmm. And oh, wait, if we have the calf, there might be some hope. But aside from that, if she doesn't have this cow as a dowry, nobody's going to marry her, and there's no hope for her.
Yeah. The way my father tells it, they both took the wrong road because our family was so poor, and they were incorrigible.
Right. And there's the title.
Yeah.
And that explains why they ran off, to do what they did. Why? Again.
Just within the home structure, the home life, they weren't doing their chores. It just seemed like they seized opportunities to do these things, rather than fetch water from the river, the river that is now raging. And so the father throws them out. He couldn't take it anymore. He showed them the door, and then says, they left for Ayutla or I don't know where, and now they are whores. That's why my father is terrified. Dacha will end up like her two sisters.
Right.
Her two sisters.
Right. And it's just, I mean, the story it's a tiny little story, but it hinges on this, for me, it hinges on that paragraph where, where in the kind of logic of this young boy, there is no hope now that the cow is gone. There's really no hope for his sister.
Yeah.
And all he can do at the end is hug her. And she's crying because she believes it too. They both believe it.
Yes.
And I almost feel we had this problem last time. Like, how do you talk about Rulfo without just saying, like, look, you gotta just read this. You know what I mean? Because otherwise, it feels like we're wrecking it somehow. Mm-hmm.
There surely would have been someone with the spunk to marry her, if only to have that very beautiful cow as well. And then
with the beautiful eyes.
With the beautiful eyes.
That adjective.
Our only hope is that the calf may still be alive.
Right.
Our only hope. The mother of this narrator, there's this whole section about her. My mother doesn't know why God has punished her by giving her such daughters, since in her family from her grandmother on, there have never been any bad people. That sounds like something the mother has said, that the mother has claimed. This never happened before. Everybody was raised with the fear of God. They were very obedient and didn't offend anyone.
Right.
Okay.
Part of this has to do with times have changed, and people like the mother can't handle it.
It does remind me a little bit in the section of Ignacio in the story we talked about last week, mm-hmm. about how our children are our children, and there are some things that we can't change or control. But the idea of morality here, coming from the mother, of course, I sort of take that little bit with a grain of salt, this judgment from her. She's so God-fearing, and she's claiming that nobody's ever done anything terrible before this, except for these two, terrible daughters, and may God help them. And the thing is that Dacha, who's 12, and they are face to face. They are confronted with this idea of her 12th birthday, about to move into her teen years. And she's developing and all the rest. And they're thinking about the calf and the dowry. And This is what is at the fore of their mind. So this extremely dangerous and damaging flood that seems to have devastated even the tamarind tree, which was like the last outpost of, of something to be salvaged, of something that could survive. Everything's gone because the cow is gone.
Right. And I think what is so wrenching about this story is that the parents and the brother know in their gut, really, that there is no way to save this 12-year-old girl. And there's no way to prevent it in their eyes. I think other writers would attempt, like, don't these people have any agency?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't the writer give them any agency? Why didn't Rulfo, give them an out here? Is it entirely true that this 12-year-old girl is doomed? No, but that's what they think. That's what they really think. And this boy is channeling his parents' fears.
I think it was Sontag who wrote about the river as being part of the girl, that the river is raging all around them, but has also somehow become part of the girl. And this paragraph at the end where it talks about she trembles all over. Meanwhile, the crest continues rising. The rotten stuff from below speckles Tacha's wet face. It's like it's inside her. It's all around her, but I don't know. There's something to your point that does seem like no, Rulfo's not going to give them an out. This is what they believe. These are the hopes they pin on this dowry, on this cow. And this is what they think can save Tacha.
Mm-hmm.
And is it really that? Can that cow really save Tacha?
Or on the flip side, the fact that the cow is gone, does it mean that she's totally not savable?
Yeah.
I think and I think it comes down to the fact that Rulfo was refusing to sort of enter and sort of make those questions less hard to answer, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe in part gets to, what makes him different than almost anybody.
Juan Rulfo is the author of Es que somos muy pobres from the collection El Llano en Llamas. It appears in translation as It's Because We're So Poor by Ilan Stavans and Harold Augenbraum in the collection The Plain in Flames, published by the University of Texas Press. The essay Winter in September is by Peter Orner and appears in his memoir in essays Am I Alone Here?, published by Catapult. He's the author of 5 other books, including Maggie Brown and Others, published by Little Brown and Company. Peter Orner holds the professorship in English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. This has been The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public on Texas Public Radio. You can write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.